Joan Truckenbrod.
Thank you very much, Gary, and thank you to everyone for coming. I appreciate your interest in my work as well as that of OSU. So I'm going to show a lot of projects today and sort of talk about how I created them. I'm going to start with a quote inspired by African ritual objects and sculptures. The hand is a source of action and an instrument of creativity. It's the vehicle that transforms the unspeakable, invisible abstractions of thought into objects of tangible, material reality to be held, admired, contemplated, narrated, and performed. That's from a book called The Shape of Belief about African sculpture and ritual objects by Mary Nutter Roberts. So I'm going to start with an installation from 1997, and this is a video of the actual installation, like documentation. It was called Torn Touch. And the reason I created this, and then I'll explain what it was, is at that point, there seemed to be this incredible push towards virtual reality. Like all of us were going to be living in Second Life or in virtual space. So I wanted to reflect back on the fact that we all have bodies and that we are in the world in a physical space. So I created this interactive installation. This is a full view here. And it was 3 monitors in cages, animal cages that were painted black to accentuate the idea that the internet is physically, or the cyberspace is physically inaccessible. And I wanted to create some visceral kinds of physical experiences. So in order to make it interactive, there were these wooden slabs with sensors underneath so that as a person moved across the space from one log to the next, if you will, there was a pressure sensor connected to each of 3 computers, and they were controlled by a precursor to the Arduino board called the EasyIO board. And as you walked in front of a monitor, it would trigger these videos of these hands kind of struggling, okay, with the fiber. And then these figures of these sort of abstract figures that I was envisioning as being in virtual reality. And what you're looking at is video from that time directly on the screen. So to collaborate with these computer flat screens inside of animal cages painted black was cheesecloth strung along a fence of barbed wire that I got in the farmland. And so the barbed wire was very rusty and visceral, and asked all the viewers to put things, pin things on the cloth that was sort of in front of them. So at the end of the exhibit, the cloth was just filled with personal items. I think I can read this. The person here is talking about creativity and spirituality being inside of them if they can only figure out how to bring it out about. So this exhibit was at the State of Illinois Gallery in Chicago, which is right downtown Chicago. And in that building are also like where to get your passport, where to get your driver's license. So the audience to this was so interesting because it was primarily a non-art audience, and they pinned amazing things on this fabric that was strung across the barbed wire fence. Also, living in the Midwest, I became sort of obsessed with salmon. As I read about them, they inspired me because they're very powerful animals and they have an incredible cycle of life. And at the same time, I was reading that, and this was late 90s, maybe early 2000, that their habitat was endangered because of agricultural and industrial chemicals. So this exhibit was in Rockford, Illinois, which is the 2nd largest city in Illinois. It's about 70 miles west of Chicago. and it's video of salmon in their salmon run, projected into water with white sand on the bottom of the pond. So the objective was to educate the public about this and the plight of salmon, which I feel is sort of like the canary in the mine, that the plight of the salmon mirrors health issues that all of us are also suffering from. And what's interesting about this, watching people look at this installation, when the salmon splash, people would jump back. So there's something very curious about projecting video into water. And also this spoke pretty powerfully, I think, to children. And also in 2000, I'm very interested in indigenous cultures. And I discovered in my reading, there were no pictures of this, but I read about ceremonies where sacred symbols would be painted on the body under the concealment of darkness, and then later in the evening these people in a ritual ceremony would dance around a fire, what we would think of as a campfire. So the sacred symbols would be revealed by the flicker of the firelight, but the symbols would also take the form of the body. So it's not like a line of text that we would read. The symbols would be gradually revealed, but within the shape of the body. So that juxtaposition of the symbols and the meaningfulness of the ritual in conjunction with the flickering firelight inspired my video work that combines objects with video that I think of as video sculpture. I have published a book on this work, and primarily artists that have inspired this work. The book is called The Paradoxical Object. It is in your library. So the next few videos are these installations that combine objects that carry cultural and social meanings with not particularly narrative videos, but sort of video, atmospheric video. And this first one, there are two videos. There's video of a nude body tumbling in water, digitally superimposed with salmon run. This piece is called Against the Current, and as you all know, salmon return upstream against the current to their birthplace to spawn, and then they die. So this was projected into a full-size hospital bed, and the sound is the rushing water as well as Tibetan flute music. So you'll see in a minute the whole installation. So what it does is challenge the viewer to put together in their own mind, from their own experience, the combination of what a hospital bed means to them with this mythology, this incredible mythology of the salmon and the power of the salmon runs. I mean, I've also been, you'll see it in the next one, to Alaska, videotaping salmon that jump up waterfalls, and the power of the water, the movement of the water is so strong, I don't believe I could have stood up in it, and yet they're going against the current and jumping up the waterfalls. And we put chairs here so people could sit. It's somewhat of a meditative environment as well. And this part of it, so I videotaped the body tumbling in water in a pool and at my house, and the bottom of the pool was light blue, and I thought, oh, this isn't going to work. So I used a black cloth, but pulling the black cloth off of the blue surface in the end of the video turned out, I found it really interesting. So the next piece, I'm also interested in transformative spaces, like creating those and embedding in the video in these spaces that have an implication of transformation. And so in trying to read about insects in animal spaces, this is a cocoon, and it has 2 video projections. The cocoon is made out of organza. I built it on a residency at Kala Art Institute in Berkeley, and it's made out of organza with metal spines. And with the organza, video mixes really well. So the 2 videos, sometimes one is more prominent than the other, and I'll tell you. So what you see on the right-hand side is a grill, and it's a grill in a fish hatchery where baby salmon are jumping obsessively trying to get out of that space. The other video was shot, and it's a much different tempo, from my mother's wheelchair in a nursing home. And here you can see the other video somewhat. We're moving down the hall past someone attempting to use a payphone, which was too high for someone in a wheelchair. But so juxtaposing that video, the walk through the nursing home, with the fish jumping at the grill, I'm positive that's how my mother felt. Constantly, in a way, trying to escape from that environment. I don't think our culture has dealt very well with the trajectory of life. And so this is another one that it was during the time that my parents were aging, and it's about the sort of empty house syndrome. So this is a model house that's 1 1/4 size larger than a normal model house. It's suspended from the gallery. This is that Flatfell Gallery in Chicago. She's no longer there, but it's suspended from the ceiling with clothesline. Again, sort of a precarious, the house being sort of in a precarious state, and projecting video of the salmon run into that, trying to maintain the resonance and the spirituality of that house. And as it turns out, I built this house based on a dollhouse that my dad had built me, but I made it 1 1/4 size larger because I wanted that size. But as the video of the salmon run goes through the house, it goes onto the back wall, and the video goes through the windows of the suspended house onto these photographs of older people, and they are behind dollhouse window frames. But it's sort of like they're looking back and looking through into this other space. And when my parents saw this, my mother reminded me that the dollhouse was designed based on the house that I had grown up in. So this became a very, this is my mom, this became a very personal piece for me, and the man that you saw was my dad. So this was after they had moved out of the home that we all grew up in, into a more assisted living facility. This is the sound is not here, but it's the sound of bubbles being blown up. And I'm interested in bubbles because of their transitory character and the fact that they grow and then they decay. And in that process, they have a very specific geometry, bubble geometry. And they also have very interesting color films, color membranes. So for me, they embodied all of that. There were 3 projections in that onto a dome made out of fabric with an aluminum frame. It's 7 feet high and 14 feet wide. And this was shown at the Corvallis Art Center in December 2015. And then in the center were these little vellum houses, and projected onto those was a single bubble. And that bubble, the video of that single bubble was created at Argonne National Lab using the advanced photon source, so they could take one slice at a time. That piece was inspired by a story that I had read about an Inuit man who was being moved from an igloo, a circular form that was integral to their sort of life and their spirituality, because the sun is round, the moon is round, the earth is round. And he was being moved into a home, which was the small homes in the middle of that. So that was really difficult for him, so I wanted to do a piece about that. When we had it in Corvallis, we also put cushions on the inside so people could sit and just watch the bubbles sort of pulse up and pulse down. And the best day, or one of the best days there, was a Saturday or Sunday, and a mom came in with 3 little kids. One young boy, he could have been 3, and he laid down on the outside of that and hung on to the aluminum structure, and darned if he was going to leave. He was never going to leave. His mother had great trouble getting him. So when an artwork can speak on different levels, it's really interesting to me, and the fact that I could connect with him through artwork was an incredibly special day. This one is a bit weird. It's a fiber sculpture, hand sewn together, designed, the pieces were then sewn together. I had a residency at the Rockford Art Museum when I had that show there. This is about 7 feet high, and it's multiple abstract figures sewn together. And the day the exhibit was supposed to open, I was still in the gallery sewing these edges together, these ridges, and the curator came in and she said, are you gonna be finished? And I'm like, okay. So these are things, art could just go on and on. The video, it's called Asymmetric Figures, and it's suspended from the ceiling. Again, it's about 7 feet tall. There are 2 videos, and they are video moving through a dense forest. And the way they were captured, I had a residency at the Roger Brown House in New Buffalo, Michigan, which is right on Lake Michigan. And in that sort of estate was a wooden platform out in the woods with power. And I had done some video capture before with these little cubicle video cameras that transmit video to the computer wirelessly. And so I put it in an HO train, and I made a figure 8 on this wooden platform. So the train went around and captured video of this forest. And when you see the fast video is when it's going around the curves. And when you see the slow video is when it's coming across a figure 8. So then the video got transferred wirelessly to the computer. It's a fascinating process. So that's the video I used on that particular one. This one, this is also in the State of Illinois Gallery. I got to install and I started to install a piece. And the curator says to me, oh, that's not the piece I meant. This is a little jarring. So, okay. And you know when a curator says that to you, okay, I'm there. So I took what I had set up down, and I went home, and I got these. These are large fiber figures I made. I draw these kind of figures, but these are 7.5 feet tall. They're double layered. They're more like a heavy white fabric, and they have metal edges that holds them up. And there are 2 or 3 videos in this. And what was interesting, there are 3 figures, I believe, where one figure would create a shadow, the other video would fill in that shadow. So you can create very interesting layer effects by using multiple objects, projecting into them from different angles, and then you get this visual synthesis. This idea of creating layers of experience comes from my interest, again, in indigenous cultures, where people live in the everyday world, but they also live in a spiritual world, and they also live in an ancestral world. the Aboriginal live very strongly in an ancestral world every day. I've just been reading a story. It's in a book by a botanist called Braiding Sweetgrass. And she is of Native American heritage. She talks of the sky world and sky woman falling down from a hole in the clouds and sort of bringing with her seeds and turning the brown into green by spreading the seeds. So I think the layering idea of creating multiple experiences comes from reading in stories from indigenous cultures. This piece was also in the Corvallis Art Center. I'm interested in the impact of or the quality in the environment and how it affects our health. So I had been on Amtrak going to Chicago, going through North Dakota, and was totally astounded during my first trip about the extent of the oil industry there and the fact that it's all coming across country in oil trains. So to sort of accentuate that concern about the health of the environment and parallel our health, I projected that with a small pocket projector into a large seashell. So this is actual video documentation of that, and I have also, I'll show you the video that was projected into the seashell. You can see it a little clearer, because in reality it was a little clearer. And I cropped the video on the edge, or mapped so that it went onto the seashell, the edges, not over the edges. And this is the actual video, and you can see the rows and rows of oil cars, and they're pulling all this oil out of the ground using fracking. So this is, I think, a horrible situation, but I guess addressed in a somewhat, I don't know, soft way, using a seashell to try to show that contrast. And you could hear the sound of the train. And they did a magnificent job at the Art Center. We mounted the seashell on a pedestal covered with, I believe, black velvet. And then we mounted the pocket projector just on the corner so that it was barely visible. So you didn't, I try not to have the technology be part of the installations because it's not interesting to me. So a lot of times I will mount the projector on the ceiling or somewhere where it's not part of the artwork itself. This is not a video installation. This is also at Flat File Gallery. She had project rooms. This was at the time a response to the initiation and the development of the war in Iraq. So I took New York Times stories about the horrendous situation there, and I had them printed on Tyvek home wrap, sort of again a contrast of, home wrap being something that would be protective, and yet it was illustrating the war in Iraq. And then I made 100 origami cranes out of the same Tyvek with the printing on it of the newspapers and hung those from the ceiling. And here's some examples of the articles that were printed on the Tyvek. And Tyvek's quite wide, so you can see, and that's just a picture of the crane. Another environmental piece, I did this in Brush Creek in Kansas City, Missouri. This piece is a floating piece of digitally printed banner material with 1/8 inch closed cell foam sewn on it so that it would make sure it was floating on the water. It's 50 feet long and it's about 45 inches wide. It was printed at my school and then sent down to Kansas City, and students helped me to sew the closed cell foam on the back. This creek is so polluted that they don't want anybody to even put their hand in it. while we were installing this, it was with the Contemporary Photography Gallery in Kansas City, which again is no longer alive or open. Somebody was gonna lower their child into the water to like swim, and the curator just went streaming down and said, no, don't put the child in there. So the idea here was to remind people of that the creek had been healthy and that there had been wildlife. And at the end of the exhibit, there were frogs and there were ducks that took up home on the... It was a really interesting, because there were condominiums along the creek, and people would come down and tell me that it was pretty impactful from their view. And it did get dirty. And my daughter was with me because the water in the creek was pretty dirty. And so I progressively got more upset. Oh, it's horrible, it's really dirty. And she finally said to me, isn't that your point? That was exactly my point. So this was a public art commission in Green Bay, Wisconsin, along the Fox River. And it also had to do with reliving or reimagining the life of wildlife and fish in the Fox River, because Indians would traverse, the Native Americans would traverse down the Fox River and rely on the fish for sustenance. So this piece, and it doesn't really move, but you can, I have the video so you can see the scale. I created the stems, if you will. They're sort of abstracted shapes of seaweed. I created them using Illustrator, and then they were laser cut, and they're stainless steel. And the fish, I don't know whether I drew those in Photoshop or Illustrator. They were cut by the company called Freeform, and they were cut out of two colorways of dichroic, what they call eco-resin, which is a plastic. And what I liked about the dichroic, one was warm and the other was cool, is that during the day, based on lighting or based on your positioning, the color would change. So as you walked, they had a river path there. As you walked down that, the colors would change, and also depending on the time of day. So this would have been later in the day, I believe, where the light was dim, but there were artificial lights around that. And you can see the shape of the stands there. And then they planted at the base. I didn't have anything to do with planting at the base. So I also have done some layered fiber pieces where they were dye sublimation. The background is on a charmeuse, which is kind of a shiny thing, and the foreground is a voile, which is translucent. They were printed in Montreal because when they were done, I think about 1994 maybe, there was nobody around Chicago that was doing dye sublimation on that scale. So I took my fabric and went to Montreal and worked with the man. It was at an experimental textile school there on the dye sub panels. Each one's about 5 to 6 feet tall, and they're 44 inches wide. I like to hang them about 18 inches apart because I think there's a resonance that develops between the foreground and the background. And that interstitial space is so important and becomes so powerful. So you can see here, as the video moves around, that it changes how the foreground image interacts with the background image. And this one has crumpled Polaroids in both images. The first one and this one really deal with issues of breast cancer. And there's a large series of prints in this series that are going to be shown at the Snyder Museum in Ashland. But living in Illinois, the EPA did a study on agricultural chemicals, and they are in fact hormone disruptors, hormone mimickers, endocrine disruptors, and hormone mimickers. So they play a role in hormone-based cancers. So I did a series on that. So now we're going to go way back. This is 1975. These are two of the drawings that were in the exhibition at the Whitney, and they're now in their permanent digital art collection. They acquired 4 drawings, and they were programmed in Fortran. I had to take 2 semesters of Fortran because I was doing drawings, but my interest in the natural world, somehow drawing, I was not resolving that at all. And I discovered that there are mathematical formulas that describe natural phenomena in the world that are invisible, like wind currents, but yet physically palpable, or light waves reflecting off of irregular surfaces. So I could embed those mathematical formulas in algorithms and then in programs to create these drawings. So they reflect that experience, and they actually have 4 of these drawings. The Victorian Albers in London has 3 of them, I believe. Okay, there. So let me tell you about the process a little bit of making those drawings at that time. So I never saw them on the screen because there was no screen. It was imagined, and then they were changed and modified over time as I drew out more images. And I usually used variables. And for me, variables are really powerful, but they're also very spontaneous and very fluid. They're like pebbles on the beach that get changed in their positioning every time the tide comes in. So I would write the programs, and then using a key punch machine and computer cards, I would punch one line of the program on each card. So the program to describe a drawing might be a shoebox big. And then I would go across campus and put the cards into a card reader. And it was connected to a mainframe computer, which I actually never saw. And so anywhere from 6 hours to 24 hours, I would get a printout of my program. And if it was not graphic, it was text. And if it looked correct, according to what I had written previously, I would ask for the data for the drawing, which was described in my program, to be put on a tape. And they put it on what they call the 16 BPI tape, which I assume was 16 bits per inch. The tape, which was about that big, I would then take the tape over to the geography department where there was a pen plotter. So now you all know how lucky you are that you don't have to do this. So the geography department, you know, I was the artist. They would use the pen plotter to make maps. So they would wait until they had some downtime, and then they would mount my tape. And the way the plotter worked was the paper, so you saw on the earlier drawings the sprockets, the paper was on a roller that would go back and forth, and the pen would go back and forth the other way. And the pen would either be up or down, depending on whether you were drawing or not drawing. However, I could never convince them to change the width of the pen point, and all of you who do drawing know how important the width of the pen is, or the line width. And I could never convince them that color might be valuable in drawing maps. So, yeah, it was an uphill struggle. And so what I did then was I'd take a series of drawings, and in this one there are 4. And I would take them to the color Xerox machine and make transparencies of individual drawings in individual colors. And then I would overlay them. So this is a series of related drawings. They are all on acetate overlaid. I think the Block Museum in Chicago has this. drawing, and maybe another, and the state of Illinois also has this. So that's how this drawing was made, and now you know how lucky you are that we have such fluid, and we even now have gestural devices to draw with computers. So I've always loved textiles. This is 1979. The drawings were 1975. I wanted to make textiles. And I now had an Apple computer with 8 colors, and pixels were boxes, as you can see here. So in order to make this is about 45 inches wide by maybe 40 inches high. Each of these each square is a 8.5 by 11. So I had, at the Art Institute, I had access, we had a 3M color and color copier with a backlight setting. What that meant is it could understand the image on the monitor. So I had an Apple computer and a monitor, so I turned the monitor upside down on the color copier and then made heat transfer images of each image in the sequence, and then hand ironed them back onto fabric. This is a polyester fabric because the 3M color and color copier used dye sheets with microencapsulated dyes, and so they had to have a synthetic fabric. And then on this one, I took each page, each image, and I cut it up according to this curvilinear pattern, rearranged them, and then hand ironed them on. And there's an interesting thing about artifacts of technology and artwork, and how we think about them and how they become part of the work. For me, in this situation, they become part of the work. There's some diagonal sort of stripes in here. That happened because the tension of the dye sheets was not exactly right. It was a very particular machine. And I don't think we see it in this image, but on some of the images, the color would fade from one corner to the next, sort of like the monitor was not happy upside down, and it had created a color fading. So this was a very long process. There are 4 of these, and they're currently all in collections. So then I got access to some higher resolution, and this is also programmed. I tried to create some photo textiles, because on those, if I had it printed so that the color areas were transparent, I was in an exhibit where we hung one of these in the middle of the gallery, and you could see the people through the shapes, and it became very interesting. But the photo's emulsion has started to disintegrate on that, so that's not going to be a long-term thing. This is also, for me, the computer was always an intermediary. The screen has never quite done it for me. It's been too constraining, and so, yeah. So this piece was also 3M's technology. They had a scan-a-mural technology. This piece is 7 feet high by 11 feet wide, and it's basically an inkjet print on canvas. So it's based on color fields, Joseph Albers' color theory, where depending on the background of the color, the visual color changes. But I want to show you a close-up, a detail, because the character of the printing process created these little white borders, which made it create a visual sense of a relief. People, unfortunately, would go up and touch these because it looked very textural, when in fact it was flat. This was early 1980s. So, jumping in textile, this is programmed in a different way. This is a hand computer-assisted jacquard loom that I am now working with, and I'm finding it incredibly invigorating. It's really, like with other computer processes, it seems unlimited. This is a textile that uses, on the left, 3 colors of yarn, and on the right, 4 colors of yarn. So you create the image as the artist, and I prefer to work with abstract imagery, even though the original image was a photograph or a combination of photographs. And then I have to, with the loom creates the necessary instructions, which turns out to be a red and white checkered screen. And then I send the shuttles back and forth, and the loom is a smart loom in that it picks up the appropriate threads to create the patterning. There are 880 threads across, but for those of you who remember DPI, it's 15 DPI. Yeah, but you know, it's absorbing the particular artifacts of a media. And if it doesn't work with what you're trying to create, you know, then it's the wrong approach. So for me, I tend to absorb almost intuitively the artifacts of the way a particular media works. This is another one, and they would be woven, this is turned a quarter of a turn, they would be woven the other way. So I'll tell you what this one is. We had one snowfall in Corvallis last winter, so I photographed through my window the trees, so you can see there's some tree forms here, but I like the juxtaposition, and so the more craggy angled pieces are broken ice on the Chicago River captured from probably the Michigan Avenue Bridge. So those two things are combined to create this textile. So I'm going to go just a few more things. This is mid-90s, and this is a combination of a live video image with a digitized image from a very early system. So with the digitizer in the early days, with the Apple or the Macintosh, you got a very abstracted image. So there's two faces here. There's the abstracted, digitized one, and then there's the live video. And at that point, there was no way to get it out of the computer except for photographing off the screen. So this would have been photographed off the screen. Using the same device, which by the way was what broadcasters used to put titling, you know, where they run video underneath and then they put titles and all that. So the previous image and this image, we're using that system where I could work with live video and then digital images over on top. And this was a whole series. Oh, so is the previous one. You're seeing one example of series of images. And this was a series of black and white. They were exhibited in Chicago. I can't remember the gallery name. I also have a pretty good interest in science. And because scientific process is so curious and so interesting, and then the way things get abstracted and described by scientific symbols. And so there's communication processes going on here. Some are distorted like formulas, some are electronic diagrams, and then there are figures that are also having a dialogue. And I did a whole series, and the next one's included, on the social construction of families in our culture and the social construction of gender in our culture, and how we take those on sort of as costumes. And so I have done a whole series where there's that kind of dialogue and tension. The background is from a slide scanner, and they're leaves and flower petals. I mean, we can draw backgrounds, but in this case, they're leaves. Oh, and they could be colorized. And then one more of these examples where there are family constructions and scientific notation systems. And the background in here is, I had a scanner that had a backlight setting, and I put a clear tray, they're like those picture frames, and I put water in it, set it on the scanner, and dropped in Dr. Martin's dyes. So I got these incredible color fields, and then I could work into them, kind of like carving. This series was called Sociotexture, and it was exhibited in a gallery in London, I think 1998. So I have one more picture. So continuing that with a higher resolution system, I began to work in much more complex images, and really dealt with also this socially constructed image of gender roles in our culture. So thank you very much.